The moment I saw her standing at my back door at 2 in the morning, I knew something was very wrong. She wasn't crying. That was the first thing I noticed. Women who've just been hurt cry. Women who've been broken down so many times they don't have tears left anymore. They stand exactly the way my daughter-in-law Heather was standing, perfectly still, both arms crossed over her stomach like she was trying to hold herself together from the inside. I pushed open the screen door before she even knocked. "Come in," I said. "Right now. Come inside." She stepped into my kitchen, and I could see her hands were shaking, not trembling, shaking. The kind of shake that comes from cold or shock or both. It was November in eastern Tennessee, and she had no coat on, just a thin cardigan over a blouse, and her shoes were wrong for the weather. Ballet flats, the kind you wear to a dinner party, not the kind you wear when you've been walking. "How far did you walk?" I asked. She looked at me like she'd forgotten I could ask questions. "From the gas station on Route 9. That was 3 miles. I put the kettle on without saying anything else and pulled a chair out from the kitchen table, and she sat down in it like her legs had just decided they were done. I got the quilt from the hall closet, the heavy one, the wedding ring pattern my mother made, and put it around her shoulders, and then I stood at the stove and waited for the water to boil, and I didn't push her. I've learned in 64 years of living that some things can't be rushed. My son had married Heather 2 years before all of this happened. She was 31, a physical therapist, quiet in the way that people mistake for shyness when it's actually just thoughtfulness. She thought before she spoke. I'd liked that about her from the first time my son brought her home. I'd liked a lot of things about her. I'd liked that she called me by my name, Loretta, instead of some uncomfortable version of Mom. I'd liked that she brought me paperback novels when she visited, because she'd noticed the shelf in my living room and remembered which authors I hadn't read yet. I'd liked that she told my son the truth even when it wasn't what he wanted to hear. My son Caleb was a good man. I want to be clear about that. He was patient and he worked hard and he loved his wife. But he had one significant flaw, and it was the same flaw his father had before him, and it was this: he could not stand conflict. He would do almost anything to avoid a fight. He'd smooth things over, redirect conversations, find some diplomatic middle ground, and most of the time that was a reasonable quality in a person. But some situations don't have a diplomatic middle ground. Some situations require you to pick a side. He had not picked a side. I poured Heather's tea and set it in front of her and pulled a chair around so I was sitting close, not across the table, and I waited. She wrapped both hands around the mug. The shaking slowed a little. "She's been putting things in my food," Heather said. I didn't react, not outwardly. Inside, something cold moved through me, but I kept my face the way I keep my face when I need to. Steady. My grandmother used to call it her listening face, and I practiced mine for decades. "What kind of things?" I said. "I don't know exactly. Laxatives, maybe, or something that causes cramping. I started keeping a food diary 3 weeks ago, what I ate and when, and then how I felt after. Every single time she'd cooked, within 2 hours I'd be sick. When I cooked myself, nothing." She looked up at me. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like something I believe," I said. She exhaled, like she'd been holding that breath for weeks. The "she" in question was my daughter-in-law's mother. Her name was Roberta, and I had known from the first time I met her that she was the kind of woman who needed to be the most important person in every room she entered. She was 68 years old and recently widowed, and she had, in the last 8 months, inserted herself into Caleb and Heather's life with a thoroughness that I found alarming and that Caleb found perfectly understandable. "She's grieving," he would say. "She just needs to feel close to Heather right now." Roberta had moved herself into their guest room in March. It was now November. I had watched it happen slowly. Heather mentioned being tired more often. She lost weight. She didn't need to lose. She stopped going to her Thursday evening book club. I just haven't had the energy. She called me less. When I did see her, there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a new careful quality to the way she spoke, like someone who'd learned that her words could be used against her. I had said something to Caleb in September. I'd driven over one afternoon when I knew Roberta had a doctor's appointment, and I'd sat in their kitchen, the same kitchen where Heather was now sitting in mine, and I'd said, "Something is wrong with your wife?" He'd said she was just adjusting to having company in the house. I'd said it wasn't adjustment, it was deterioration. He looked uncomfortable and changed the subject to football. So when Heather sat in my kitchen that November night and told me what she believed was happening, I didn't doubt her. I'd been watching her disappear for 8 months. I just hadn't known why. "Does Caleb know?" I asked. She looked at her tea. I tried to tell him. He said I was under stress. He said his mother-in-law would never do something like that. She paused. He said those exact words. His mother-in-law, like he'd forgotten which mother-in-law I was. I felt something tighten in my chest. I recognized the error immediately. Caleb had been trying to comfort her by defending the wrong person. He'd meant me. He'd meant to say that I would never do something like that. But in his stumbling, well-meaning attempt to smooth things over, he'd accidentally defended the very person Heather was accusing. Or maybe he'd understood exactly who she meant and had defended her anyway. I wasn't sure which was worse. "How long have you been keeping the food diary?" I asked. 3 weeks. "Do you still have it?" She pulled a small spiral notebook from the pocket of her cardigan. She'd had it with her the whole time, I realized. She'd walked 3 miles in November with that notebook in her pocket because she knew she was going to need it. I took it from her and read it carefully. Every entry was neat and precise. The physical therapist's attention to documentation. Date, time, what she'd eaten, who had prepared it, onset of symptoms, duration, severity on a scale of 1 to 10. There were 14 incidents in 3 weeks. 13 of them followed meals prepared by Roberta. One of them, a 7 out of 10 for cramping and nausea, came after a cup of tea Roberta had brought to her in bed when she was supposedly already ill. The cup of tea given to a sick woman to help her feel better. I closed the notebook and held it in my lap. "Is there anything else?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm 8 weeks pregnant." I put my hand over hers. "She doesn't know," Heather said. "I haven't told anyone. I just found out 10 days ago, and then I needed to know if I was right first, before I told anyone. Because if I'm right, I cannot bring a baby into that house with that woman in it, and Caleb won't ask her to leave, so I needed." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I needed someone to believe me before I could figure out what to do next." "I believe you," I said. "I believed you before you showed me the notebook." We sat there in my kitchen for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. The heater clicked on. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear it finding every gap in my old farmhouse, the way wind always does. I thought about Roberta. I'd been thinking about her in various forms for months. She was charming in public, quick with a compliment, interested in everyone's grandchildren, the type of woman who always brought a casserole to the bereaved. At Caleb and Heather's wedding, she'd given a speech about letting go and trusting your children to find their own way, and there hadn't been a dry eye in the room. I'd watched her give that speech, and I'd thought, she doesn't mean a word of this. I'd thought it and then felt guilty for thinking it, because what kind of woman suspects another woman of insincerity at a wedding? The kind of woman who pays attention I now understood. "You're going to stay here tonight," I said to Heather. "And tomorrow we're going to make some phone calls." She looked at me. "What kind of phone calls?" "The kind that end this. I have a younger sister named Patrice. She is 59 years old and she is an attorney, family law, mostly, though she spent years before that in criminal defense, and she has never entirely lost the instincts that come with it. We grew up in a house where our mother taught us that silence was sometimes protection and sometimes surrender, and you had to know the difference. Patrice knows the difference better than anyone I've ever met." I called her at 7 the next morning. Heather was asleep in the guest room, the first real sleep I suspected she'd had in months. I stood on my back porch in the cold with my coffee, and I told Patrice everything. There was a pause when I finished. "Does she have a doctor she trusts?" Patrice asked. "Someone Roberta doesn't know." "She can find one. She needs a full workup. If there's anything in her system that shouldn't be there, we need documentation before it clears. How long since the last incident?" "She walked here last night. She didn't need anything Roberta made yesterday." "Then first thing this morning, before anything else." Another pause. "Loretta, you understand what we're saying here?" "I understand exactly what we're saying." "Caleb is going to push back." "I know." "He may push back hard." "I know that too." There was a sound from inside. Heather moving around in the kitchen, the soft click of a cabinet. I turned and looked through the window and saw her standing at my stove in the oversized sweatshirt I'd left out for her hair in a loose braid, her face still swollen from sleep but something different in it. She was reading the note I'd left about the coffee and the eggs, and she almost smiled. Almost. "I'm not asking for his permission," I said to Patrice. "I just need you to walk me through the steps." She walked me through the steps. The doctor, a woman Heather had seen twice before at a clinic in the next county, someone with no connection to Roberta, saw her that morning. Heather was honest with her about everything. The doctor listened without expression and ordered blood work. She also confirmed the pregnancy and noted that Heather's iron levels were significantly depleted, her blood pressure lower than it should be, and that she presented with several markers consistent with chronic low-level poisoning, though she was careful with her language, careful to say consistent with rather than caused by, because that was what the evidence currently supported. It was enough. We didn't go to Caleb first. That was Patrice's call, and I agreed with it. We went to the evidence first. We documented everything we could document in 48 hours, the food diary, the medical records, a written account from Heather of every incident she could remember. And then Patrice made one more call to a colleague who handled situations of elder mistreatment and domestic harm, and that colleague told us exactly what the next steps looked like from a legal standpoint. Then we called Caleb. I asked him to come to my house. I didn't tell him why. He arrived at 4 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon, looking slightly annoyed and slightly worried, which was the expression he wore whenever he suspected someone was about to create a situation he'd have to navigate. He walked into my living room and found Heather sitting on the couch, Patrice sitting in the armchair, and me standing by the fireplace, and something in his face shifted. "What's happening?" he said. "Sit down, Caleb," I said. He sat. I let Heather talk first. She'd asked to be the one to tell him, and I'd said yes without hesitation because it was her story and her marriage, and she deserved to be heard in her own words. She talked for almost 20 minutes, and she didn't cry, and she didn't raise her voice, and she laid it out exactly the way she'd laid it out to me. Precisely, carefully, with the notebook open in her lap and the medical report from the clinic folded beside it. When she finished, the room was quiet. Caleb sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, and he stared at the floor for a long time. I watched his face. I watched him the way I'd watched him his whole life, the way you watch someone you love more than anything navigate something hard, the way you want desperately to make it easier for them and know that you can't. "Mom," he finally said, and I knew from the way he said it that he meant his mother-in-law. "Caleb." "She wouldn't." "The blood work came back," Patrice said, not unkindly. She had the copy in her hand and she held it out to him. "There are elevated levels of a compound consistent with the active ingredient in a common osmotic laxative. In the concentration Heather's carrying, particularly given her pregnancy, it would have caused exactly what she's been experiencing, possibly more than that, over time." He took the paper. He looked at it for a long time. "She's been in your house for 8 months, I said. "Heather asked her to give them space twice. Both times she involved you in the conversation, and both times you helped smooth it over. I'm not saying that to blame you. I'm saying it because I need you to understand that the way this continued was not only about what Roberta was doing, it was also about what you weren't doing." He looked up at me. His eyes were wet. "She's my wife's mother," he said. "I know." She just lost her husband. She has nobody. She has made choices, I said. She's made choices that put your wife's health at risk. She has made choices that put your unborn child at risk. And you have a choice to make right now. The word unborn landed the way I knew it would. He looked at Heather. You're pregnant? Heather nodded. He stood up and crossed the room and sat down next to her and put his face in his hands, and I heard the sound that comes out of a person when something they've been refusing to see becomes unavoidable. It's not exactly crying. It's more like grief, like mourning something you should have protected when you still had the chance. I let him have a minute. Then, Caleb, what are you going to do? He looked up. His face had changed. The careful diplomatic look was gone, and something harder had replaced it. Not anger exactly, but resolution. Like a man who has finally found the place where smoothing things over becomes unacceptable. I'm going to ask her to leave, he said. Tonight, Patrice said. It wasn't a suggestion. Tonight. He did it that evening. Patrice went with him, not to intervene, but to ensure that the conversation stayed on track and that Roberta couldn't reframe or redirect it into something it wasn't. I stayed with Heather. We sat on my couch, and she put her feet up, and I made soup. Real soup, from scratch with the good stock I keep in the freezer, and we watched an old movie neither of us had seen before. Something from the 1970s with a lot of earth tones and a story about two women who figure things out together. Heather fell asleep before the ending. I watched her sleep for a moment. The shadow under her eyes was still there. The careful quality in her posture was still there. Those things would take time. But there was something else present too. A looseness in her face that hadn't been there in months, the look of a person who has set down something very heavy. I turned off the lamp and went to the kitchen to do the dishes. Patrice called at 9:15. I could hear in her voice that it had not been simple. Roberta had cycled through at least 3 different responses. Denial, tears, and then a cold fury that Patrice described as the real version of her. She'd accused Heather of being manipulative. She'd accused me of turning her daughter against her. She'd told Caleb he was abandoning her. He'd held his ground. That was the thing I hadn't been entirely sure he would do, and he'd done it. He'd said what needed to be said, and he hadn't backed down. And when it was over, Roberta had packed a bag and left with the number of a hotel in town and the understanding that the rest of her things would be available for pickup when she arranged it. How is he? I asked Patrice. Shaken, sad, but clear, she said. He keeps saying he should have seen it sooner. He'll have to make peace with that in his own time. He asked me to tell you, thank you. I didn't say anything for a moment. Tell him to thank his wife, I said. She's the one who kept the notebook. What happened in the weeks after was not simple or clean. These things never are. Roberta hired her own attorney and made noise about slander. But when Patrice responded with the documentation, the medical report, the food diary, a formal summary of events, the noise stopped. Roberta left the county entirely. Her sister lived in Arizona, and she went there. Whether she's still there, I don't know. I don't spend much time thinking about Roberta anymore. Caleb and Heather moved through a period that was hard in the way that honest reckonings are hard. He had to acknowledge that he'd chosen comfort over clarity for too long, and she had to let him do that work without letting her resentment close the distance between them. They went to a counselor together. Heather's idea, and to his credit. Caleb agreed without being asked twice. I heard about these things in fragments, the way you hear about your children's lives when they're adults, a little at a time, in between other conversations. In the spring, their daughter was born, 5 pounds, 14 ounces. They named her June, which had been Heather's grandmother's name. I was there when she was born. I sat in the waiting room at the hospital for 6 hours with Patrice, and we drank bad coffee and talked about everything except what we were waiting for, the way you do when the waiting feels too big to address directly. When Caleb came out to find us, his eyes were red and his hands were shaking exactly the way Heather's had been on my back porch 6 months before, except that this time the shaking was joy. He brought us in to see them. Heather was exhausted in the way that looks like triumph. The baby was impossibly small and impossibly complete, with a furrow between her brows like she was already working something out. Heather looked up at me over the baby's head. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. There's a kind of acknowledgement that passes between women who've been through something together that doesn't require words, and I felt it then, the full weight of the previous November, the notebook, the 3-mile walk, the kitchen at 2 in the morning, all of it compressed into a single look. I squeezed her hand. Patrice was already crying, which she would deny later with great conviction. I've been thinking lately about what my mother used to tell us when we were girls. She grew up in a time when women were taught to manage quietly, to absorb difficulty, smooth conflict, maintain the surface of things at whatever cost to what lay beneath. She'd absorbed that lesson herself, to her own cost, but she passed something different on to us. She used to say, the people who love you are the ones who stay present when it's hard, not the ones who arrive with a casserole and a speech about letting go, the ones who sit with you in the hard place until there's a way through it. I didn't understand the full weight of that until I was older, until I'd seen the difference between people who performed love and people who did it, until I'd watched a young woman walk 3 miles in November with a small spiral notebook in her pocket because she needed someone to believe her. She needed someone to stay present. That's not nothing, that's everything actually. That's the only treasure that matters. I keep thinking about that spiral notebook. Heather had carried it in her cardigan pocket for 3 miles in the November cold. Not her phone, not her keys, not anything else. Just that notebook, because she understood, even in the middle of being gaslit and worn down and made to feel like she was imagining things, that the truth needed to be written down. That evidence was the difference between being believed and being dismissed. That's not the thinking of a woman who has given up. That's the thinking of a woman who has decided to fight smart instead of loud. I've lived long enough to know that the people who survive the hardest things aren't always the loudest or the strongest in the obvious ways. They're the ones who stay clear-headed when everything around them is designed to make them doubt themselves. Heather stayed clear-headed. She documented. She waited until she had something real in her hands. And then she walked to the one person she believed would look at the evidence without flinching. That took courage I don't think she gets enough credit for. But here's the thing that stays with me most. Roberta didn't fail because she was caught. She failed because of what she chose to be. Every decision she made, the manipulation, the slow erosion of her own daughter's health, the performance of generosity in public while causing harm in private, those decisions had a weight to them. Not cosmic, not religious, just the plain, ordinary weight of cause and effect. She built something corrosive into the foundation of that household, and foundations like that don't hold. They collapse. Maybe not today, maybe not in the way you'd predict, but they collapse. And Caleb, my son, I love him without conditions, and I also know exactly where he failed. He had the information in front of him. Not all of it, but enough. He had a wife who was losing weight and losing energy and losing herself piece by piece, and he chose comfort over clarity because clarity was going to require him to do something hard. That is a failure of character, and I say that not to condemn him, but because I think honesty about it is the only way it doesn't repeat itself. He knew, when he finally sat in my living room and looked at that medical report, that the cost of avoiding conflict is sometimes paid by the people who love you most. He'll carry that knowledge now. I think it will make him better. What I want, when I think about little June, 5 pounds 14 ounces with that furrow between her brows, is for her to grow up watching her mother's example, not the 3-mile walk, not the drama of that November. The notebook. The patience, the decision to gather the truth quietly and carefully before bringing it into the light. That is what it looks like to face something terrible with your mind intact and your spine straight. My mother raised Patrice and me to know the difference between managing quietly and staying silent when silence is surrender. It took me most of my life to understand the full weight of that distinction. It took Heather one very long night, and she understood it completely. The people who love you are the ones who stay present when it's hard. Everything else is just performance. June will know the difference. I'll make sure of it.